She was deemed unmarriageable, so her father gave her to his strongest slave, a decision that would spark the most dangerous love story the plantation had ever seen. But this wasn't a tale of surrender. This was a story of defiance. This was about two people who had nothing left to lose, finding everything in each other and burning the entire system down in the process. Catherine Elizabeth Ashford was 23 years old, and by every measure that mattered in 1827 Georgia, she was worthless. Her father, Edmund Ashford, had spent the better part of a decade trying to marry her off. Suitors arrived with promise and left with excuses. She was too opinionated, too tall, too pale. Her dowry wasn't generous enough. Her bloodline, while respectable, wasn't distinguished enough. The whispers grew louder with each failed engagement until the truth became unavoidable. No man of standing wanted her. Edmund watched his daughter from across the dining table, her eyes fixed on a book instead of the plate before her. She didn't care about the suitors. She didn't perform the delicate dance of femininity that attracted husbands. She read. She questioned. She challenged. In a world where women were meant to be ornamental, Catherine was difficult. But it wasn't her personality that destroyed her prospects. It was worse than that. 3 years ago, Catherine had been engaged to a man named Thomas Meridian, a plantation owner's son with connections and wealth. The engagement was celebrated. The wedding was planned. And then, 1 month before the ceremony, Thomas's betrothed sister fell ill with scarlet fever. Catherine insisted on nursing her. For 2 weeks, she sat at the girl's bedside, applying cool cloths to her burning forehead, holding her hand through the delirium. The sister survived. Catherine caught the fever. She nearly died. And when she emerged from that illness, she emerged changed. The fever had left her with something the doctors couldn't explain and society couldn't forgive. Her left eye had developed a peculiar cloudiness, a white film that caught the light at certain angles. It didn't impair her vision. It made her look haunted. Thomas Meridian withdrew his proposal within the week. After that, no one came. Edmund had once been proud of his daughter. He'd bragged about her education, her wit. But pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. Catherine was a burden, an unmarried woman consuming his resources, tying up capital that should have been invested in the plantation, in slaves, in expansion. Every year she remained unmarried was a failure that reflected poorly on him. He had considered sending her to live with a distant cousin in Charleston. He'd thought about sponsoring her into a convent, but these solutions required money and explanation, both of which he lacked in sufficient quantity. Then, 6 months ago, Edmund purchased Samuel. Samuel was 28, born into slavery on a rice plantation in the Low Country before being sold at auction to Edmund Ashford. He was broad-shouldered and muscular, the kind of man auction masters advertised as strong and obedient. Edmund had bought him for the fields, but what he quickly realized was that Samuel possessed something rarer, the bearing of a man who had once been more than a slave. There were scars on Samuel's back that told the story of resistance. His eyes held something that hadn't been fully broken, a quiet intelligence that made overseers nervous. Edmund had nearly sold him twice, but the man's work ethic was flawless. He never spoke out of turn. He never looked directly at white people. He had simply accepted. It was this acceptance that gave Edmund an idea. One afternoon, Edmund sat in his study with a brandy in hand, staring at the ledgers that made his head throb. Catherine's existence was draining him. And Samuel was an asset that could serve multiple purposes if Edmund was clever enough. The solution came to him fully formed, the kind of brutal genius that men convince themselves is practical necessity rather than cruelty. He would give Catherine to Samuel, not in marriage, of course. The law didn't allow such things, but he could make Samuel Catherine's personal attendant, her shadow, her constant companion. She would be supervised without the expense of a full household staff. Samuel would be given purpose. and Edmund would eliminate the problem of her unmarried status by making her unavailable, compromised. A woman alone with a slave would have her reputation destroyed. No respectable man would want her after that. It was perfect. It was pragmatic. It solved everything. Edmund didn't consider what Catherine would think. He didn't consider what Samuel would think. In his mind, he'd already played out the entire scenario. Samuel would serve. Catherine would adjust. Life would continue. The plantation would prosper. He was a man accustomed to being right. Samuel was brought to Catherine's quarters on a Tuesday morning in March. Catherine was sitting by the window, her embroidery untouched in her lap when she heard the knock. Her father entered without waiting for permission, followed by Samuel, who kept his eyes trained on the floor. "Catherine," Edmund said, his voice carrying the tone of a man delivering good news. "I've made a decision regarding your household. You'll require a personal attendant, someone to manage your needs, your correspondence, your daily requirements. Samuel will fulfill that role." Catherine looked at the enslaved man standing in her bedroom. She was old enough to understand what this arrangement meant. She was educated enough to grasp the implications. She was clever enough to know that her father had found a way to ensure that no man would ever marry her now. Her father had declared her doubly worthless, but what Catherine didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that Samuel had heard Edmund's instructions before arriving at her door. The overseer had made Samuel's role abundantly clear. He was to observe Miss Ashford's behavior, report any improprieties, and generally serve as her jailer disguised as her servant. Samuel raised his eyes for just a fraction of a second and met Catherine's gaze. In that moment, two people who had both been deemed disposable recognized something in each other, another human being with nowhere left to fall. Edmund turned to leave, satisfied with his pragmatism. "Samuel will begin immediately. You're to treat him as you would any servant, Catherine. He'll sleep in the quarters designated for household staff. He's here for your convenience." After Edmund left, Catherine and Samuel stood in silence. Catherine returned to her embroidery. Samuel positioned himself in the corner of the room, becoming part of the furniture. But something had shifted. And that's when everything began to change in ways neither of them could have anticipated. The first week was suffocating silence. Samuel arrived each morning before dawn and positioned himself in the corner of Catherine's sitting room like a piece of furniture that had learned to breathe. He carried her tea. He mended her dresses. He organized her books. He did everything a servant was supposed to do while becoming invisible. Or so he tried. Catherine, meanwhile, conducted her life as though he wasn't there. She read for hours, her eyes tracking across pages while Samuel watched the light move across the room. She played the pianoforte with stiff, mechanical precision, her fingers striking keys without passion. She sat at dinner with her father in near total silence, enduring Edmund's commentary about plantation business and market prices. But invisibility was harder than Samuel expected. It was impossible, in fact, when the person you were supposed to ignore kept catching your eye. On the fourth day, Catherine dropped a book. Deliberately, Samuel was certain, and it fell open to a passage about the Haitian Revolution. She left it there on the floor. When Samuel picked it up to return it to the shelf, he saw her watching him in the mirror's reflection. She had been testing him. On the sixth day, Catherine asked him a direct question, not a command. A question. "Do you read, Samuel?" He should have said no. The answer that would keep him safe, that would maintain the fiction that he was merely an extension of her household, a tool without thoughts or preferences. But something in her voice, a genuine curiosity rather than idle curiosity, made him pause. "Yes, ma'am," he said quietly. She didn't respond, but her hands stopped moving on her embroidery for a long moment. That evening, Edmund summoned Samuel to the study. The overseer was there too, his face dark with purpose. "The girl has been asking you questions," Edmund said flatly. It wasn't a question. "Only one question, sir," Samuel replied, keeping his voice level. "She asked if I could read." "And what did you tell her?" "That I could, sir." Edmund's face reddened. He rose from his chair and moved toward Samuel with a slowness that suggested violence was being carefully considered. "You are not her companion, Samuel. You are not her intellectual equal. You are her servant. Your purpose is to ensure she remains isolated and compromised, not to engage with her in conversation. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir." "If I discover you've had another conversation with her, I will sell you downriver. There are plantation owners in Louisiana who would work you to death in half a season. Is that understood?" "Yes, sir." But as Samuel returned to Catherine's quarters that night, something had changed in him. The threat of being sold downriver wasn't new. It had hung over him since the moment the auction block's gavel fell. What was new was that Edmund's fury told Samuel something crucial. Catherine was already becoming a problem. Already the arrangement wasn't working as Edmund had planned. Catherine was awake when he entered her room. She was sitting by the window, silhouetted against the moonlight, still fully dressed. "Your father was angry," she said. "It wasn't a question." "Yes, ma'am." "Because of me. Because I asked you a question." Samuel didn't respond. There was nowhere safe in this conversation. Catherine turned to face him fully. In the darkness, he couldn't see her clearly, but he could hear the calculation in her voice. "He sent you here to ruin me," she said, "to make me so compromised that no one would marry me. He succeeded, didn't he? The moment you walked through that door, my reputation was destroyed. The servants have already spread rumors. By week's end, everyone in the county will know I'm alone with you." Samuel's chest tightened. She understood her father's cruelty completely. "But what he doesn't understand," Catherine continued, "is that being already ruined means I have nothing left to lose. And neither do you, if I'm understanding the dynamic correctly. You're here as his weapon, and if you fail to be sufficiently degrading to me, he'll sell you. So we're both trapped. We're both disposable." She stood and moved closer to him. In the darkness, her pale eye caught the moonlight and seemed to glow. "The question is, what do we do about it?" Samuel's mind raced through consequences and dangers. Every instinct told him to retreat, to maintain the careful distance that kept him safe. But Catherine had named something true. They were both already destroyed in Edmund's eyes. The only question left was whether they would accept that destruction or fight it. "We do nothing, ma'am," he said carefully. "We maintain proper distance. We give him no cause for complaint." Catherine smiled, a small, sad smile. "You're right, of course. That's the smart choice." She returned to the window and dismissed him with a gesture. But sleep didn't come to Samuel that night. He lay in the servants' quarters, staring at the darkness, thinking about a woman who had already been deemed worthless, trying to find meaning in a world that offered her none. And he realized, with something close to terror, that he was beginning to care what happened to her. The second crack was forming, not in the world Edmund had built, but in Samuel himself, in the careful walls he'd constructed to survive enslavement. And the worst part wasn't the danger, it was that he wasn't sure he wanted to repair it anymore. 2 months passed in careful choreography. By day, Samuel was the perfect servant, invisible, obedient, utterly proper. He maintained distance. He spoke only when spoken to. He became the kind of enslaved man that made overseers nod approvingly, broken, compliant, safe. By night, everything changed. It started with books. Catherine began leaving volumes on the small table near Samuel's corner of the sitting room, volumes she'd ostensibly finished reading. A book of poetry, a treatise on philosophy, a novel smuggled from Charleston that Edmund would have forbidden her to own. Samuel would read them in the servants' quarters after the house fell silent. By candlelight, hunched over pages that could get him whipped if discovered, he'd lose himself in words that spoke to something in him that slavery had tried to kill. And the next morning, Catherine would ask him nothing. They maintained the fiction, but her eyes would flick toward his briefly, a question and an answer passing between them in a single glance. It was the smallest rebellion. It was everything. Then came the night Edmund left for a week-long business trip to Savannah. Catherine waited until the house had fallen into complete darkness, until even the servants' quarters had gone silent. Then she lit a single candle in the library, the vast room where Edmund kept his collection of leather-bound books that he rarely read. Samuel found her there, wearing her nightgown, her hair down around her shoulders like she was half undressed. She looked young. She looked terrified. She looked alive in a way he'd never seen before. "I couldn't sleep," she whispered. Will you sit with me? Not as a servant. Just sit." Every rational part of Samuel screamed at him to refuse, to leave immediately, to return to the servants' quarters and pretend this never happened. If anyone discovered them like this, alone, in the middle of the night with her in her nightgown, there would be no explanation that could save him. Edmund would kill him. Slowly, he sat down anyway. They didn't touch. They didn't speak much. Catherine opened a book of poetry and read aloud, her voice soft in the darkness, the words washing over him like water. Samuel listened, his hands gripping the arms of the chair so tightly his knuckles turned white. "Why are you so afraid?" Catherine asked, not looking at him. "Because this is dangerous, ma'am." "I know." "Because your father will kill me if he finds out." "I know that, too." She turned a page. The candlelight caught her profile, the delicate curve of her jaw, the slight tremor in her hands. "I've been afraid my entire life," Catherine said quietly, "afraid of saying the wrong thing, afraid of looking the wrong way, afraid of the future my father was building for me, some quiet, suffocating life married to a man who would own me just as surely as he owns you. And then I got sick, and I was afraid the fever would kill me. And when it didn't, I was afraid I'd have to live in a world that had decided I was unmarriageable." She turned to look at him for the first time. "But you know what I stopped being afraid of?" Samuel didn't answer. "Being already ruined. Because if I'm already ruined, then I can't be ruined further, which means I can do whatever I want now. I can read forbidden books. I can sit alone with a black man in the middle of the night. I can want things that are impossible, because the worst has already happened. The worst hasn't happened yet, ma'am." "No," she agreed. "I suppose it hasn't. But maybe that's the point. Maybe the worst is coming, no matter what we do. So perhaps we should at least have the memory of this, of sitting together, of you listening to poetry, of me pretending for just one night that I'm something other than a burden to everyone I've ever known." Samuel's chest felt like it was collapsing inward. "What's your full name?" Catherine asked. "Your real name, not the name your father calls you?" "Samuel Okonkwo," he said quietly. "Before the auction, before Georgia, my mother called me Sam." "Sam," Catherine repeated as though testing the weight of it. "That's a good name." "Your father gave you that name?" "No, I kept it. I kept the one thing I could keep, my own name, buried where no one could take it from me." They sat in silence after that, the book forgotten on Catherine's lap. The candle burned lower, casting shadows across their faces. Samuel knew this moment would have consequences. He knew it was a threshold they shouldn't cross. But as he sat there, listening to Catherine's breathing, watching the candlelight flicker across her skin, he understood something that terrified him more than any threat Edmund could make. He was no longer capable of turning back. When Edmund's carriage returned 5 days later, Samuel and Catherine had perfected the illusion of distance. But the library had become a sacred space, a place where they met in the darkness, where Samuel read aloud while Catherine listened, where they talked about books and philosophy and the impossible futures that would never be allowed to exist. Edmund noticed nothing, or perhaps he noticed everything and believed it didn't matter. Catherine was already ruined in his eyes. What did it matter if she spent her time reading with her servant? She was worthless to him either way. He didn't understand that he'd created something he couldn't control, that in giving Samuel to Catherine, he'd accidentally given her a mirror, someone who saw her humanity where the world saw only her flaws. And Samuel had been handed the one thing that could break him completely. 6 months into the arrangement, everything began to unravel. It started small, servants whispering in the kitchen about the strange closeness between Miss Catherine and her attendant. A visiting relative from Charleston commenting on how familiar Samuel seemed around her. Edmund's overseer reporting that Samuel had been seen carrying books to Catherine's quarters, books that weren't meant for a slave's hands. But the real breaking point came when Catherine's childhood friend Margaret arrived unannounced for a week-long visit. Margaret was everything Catherine wasn't: pretty in the conventional way, engaged to a respectable planter's son, destined for the life that had been denied to Catherine. She arrived in a whirl of expensive fabric and social ambition, and within hours she'd noticed something was profoundly wrong. "Why is that man always hovering around you?" Margaret asked, watching as Samuel brought tea to Catherine's sitting room. "It's terribly improper, even for a servant arrangement." "He's just doing his duties," Catherine replied, but her voice was too careful. Margaret's eyes narrowed. She was observant in the way that cruel people often are, attuned to weakness, to deviation, to anything that could be weaponized. Over the next 3 days, Margaret watched. She noticed the way Samuel's eyes tracked Catherine across a room. She noticed the way Catherine's shoulders relaxed when he entered a space. She noticed the careful distance they maintained and understood, with perfect clarity, exactly what that distance meant. On the 4th night, Margaret cornered Catherine in her bedroom. "You're in love with him," Margaret said flatly. Not a question. A diagnosis. Catherine's hands trembled as she set down her hairbrush. There was no point in lying. Margaret had already seen the truth written across both their faces. "It doesn't matter what I feel," Catherine said quietly. "Of course it matters. It's absolutely catastrophic. If this becomes known, and it will become known, you won't just be unmarriageable. You'll be ruined in a way that goes beyond social ostracism. Your father will have him killed, and you'll be sent away. To a convent, probably? Or locked away somewhere. Is that what you want?" Catherine turned to face her friend, and there was something in her expression that Margaret hadn't expected. Not shame, but defiance. "What I want was never going to be allowed anyway. At least this way, I want something real." Margaret's face went pale, then red, then something harder. "I can't help you with this," she said, "and I won't keep this secret. I can't. My family's reputation, my engagement, it's all too important. If anyone discovers I knew and said nothing, I'll be implicated. I won't let you destroy my life along with your own." She left the room without another word. Catherine found Samuel in the library that night, where he was waiting for her with the terrible knowledge that everything had changed. "Margaret knows," Catherine said simply. Samuel's face went absolutely still. "What will she do?" "Tell her mother. Her mother will tell my father. By tomorrow, everyone will know." Samuel moved to the window, his body rigid with the kind of tension that precedes violence or collapse. Outside, the Georgia night was warm and thick with the sound of insects. "We have to leave," he said quietly. "Where?" "North. There are places, communities in Pennsylvania, New York, people who help." "Samuel." Catherine's voice was gentle but firm. "You're enslaved. You can't just leave. My father will hunt you. There are slave catchers. There are laws." "Then I'll die," he said flatly. "But I won't let him have me again. I won't go back to being a tool, a thing without agency, pretending I don't feel what I feel for you." Catherine moved to him, and, for the first time, touched him deliberately. She placed her hand on his arm, and the contact was electric, dangerous and necessary in equal measure. "I won't let you die for me," she whispered. "You don't have a choice in that," Samuel replied. Just like I don't have a choice in loving you, even though it's destroying us both." The words hung between them, a confession and a curse. They didn't sleep that night. Instead, they sat in the library as dawn approached, holding hands in the darkness, understanding that whatever came next would be catastrophic. Edmund would separate them. Samuel would be sold, probably to a brutal overseer in Louisiana or Mississippi. Catherine would be locked away, forgotten, left to rot in some institution. But at least they'd had this. At least they'd known for a moment what it felt like to be seen, to be chosen, to matter to someone. At least they'd defied the world that said they were worthless. When Edmund's voice roared through the house the next morning, summoning Samuel to the study, they both knew it was over. Samuel squeezed Catherine's hand once, a final contact, and walked toward his own destruction. Edmund was waiting with the overseer, his face twisted with rage and something darker, a kind of triumphant vindication. He'd known something was wrong. He just wanted to catch them in the act. "You've contaminated her," Edmund said, his voice shaking with fury. "You've poisoned her with your presence, your conversation, your very existence." "I've done nothing but serve, sir," Samuel said, knowing it was a lie they both understood. "Silence. You will be taken to the auction block in Augusta tomorrow. I'm selling you to a buyer in the Mississippi Territory. You'll spend the rest of your brief life working yourself to death in swamps and cotton fields, and you should thank God for that mercy because what I want to do is far worse." Edmund turned to the overseer. "Lock him in the barn. No food, no water. He leaves at first light tomorrow?" As Samuel was dragged away, he thought of Catherine in her room above, listening to this happen, understanding that her rebellion had cost him everything. And he didn't regret it. Not for a second, because for 6 months he had been more than a slave. He had been a man. He had been loved. He had been chosen. It would have to be enough. Catherine heard the commotion from her bedroom. Her father's roaring voice, the sound of Samuel being dragged across the wooden floors, the heavy slam of the barn door. She pressed her ear against the cold glass of her window and watched the overseer chain Samuel to a post in the barn's interior, visible through the open doors in the late afternoon light. The chains caught the dying sun, glinting like instruments of torture. Samuel didn't resist. He didn't cry out. He simply accepted the restraints with the practiced resignation of someone who had lived his entire life knowing this moment would come, when his humanity would be stripped away and replaced with the cold reality of property. Then the doors slammed shut, and he was gone from her sight. She didn't cry. She couldn't cry. Crying would be a luxury she didn't deserve, not when Samuel was locked in darkness, not when her actions had sealed his fate. Instead, she sat on the edge of her bed, perfectly still, understanding with crystalline clarity what her rebellion had cost. Her hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the mattress. The afternoon light was fading, casting long shadows across her room, shadows that seemed to mirror the darkness that had descended upon everything she'd allowed herself to hope for. Outside her window, servants moved about their evening tasks, completely unaware that the world had just ended. Margaret's betrayal echoed in her mind like a wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. The shock of it wasn't the betrayal itself. Catherine had always known that loyalty was a luxury only the powerful could afford, but rather the speed with which Margaret had moved to protect her own position. Within hours of discovering the truth, Margaret had fled to her mother's house, spreading the story like poison through the social networks that bound the planter class together. By now, Catherine knew, half the county had heard the scandalous tale. Catherine Whitmore, the unmarriageable daughter, had been caught in an improper relationship with her enslaved attendant. The details would grow more salacious with each retelling, the rumor mill grinding away at the truth until it became something grotesque and unrecognizable. Edmund came to her room as the sun was setting, his silhouette filling the doorway like a curse given physical form. "Your little experiment is over," he said coldly, stepping into the room without invitation. His voice carried the particular venom of a man who felt personally betrayed. That man will be gone by morning. He will never return to this house. You will never speak of him again. Do you understand?" Catherine looked at her father, really looked at him, and saw a man, hollowed out by his own cruelty, sustained only by the illusion that his choices were justified, necessary, pragmatic. She saw the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides, the way his jaw worked as though he were chewing on words too vicious to speak aloud. "Yes," she said simply. "You brought shame on this household. You brought shame on yourself. Margaret's mother has already spread the news through the county. You are now beyond even the compromise I'd arranged for you. No man will marry you. No respectable family will associate with us. You've destroyed everything." He paced the room, his footsteps heavy against the wooden floor, each step a punctuation mark of his fury. "Do you understand what you've done?" Edmund continued, his voice rising. "Do you comprehend the damage? I brought that man into this house as a mercy, a final opportunity for you to understand your place in the world. I gave you a chance to find meaning, however twisted that meaning might be. And you repaid me with betrayal, with contamination, with the most vile, degrading relationship imaginable." Catherine remained silent. There was nothing she could say that would appease him, and they both knew it. Apologies would ring hollow. Explanations would be dismissed as excuses. The only thing left was endurance, sitting in the face of his rage and refusing to shatter. "I want you gone from this house within the week," Edmund continued, his voice dropping to something more dangerous than shouting. "I'm sending you to my sister in Savannah. You'll live quietly. You'll speak to no one about what happened here. You'll become a ghost, invisible, forgotten, exactly as you should have been from the beginning. Perhaps in time the scandal will fade. Perhaps in time this will be forgotten." He paused, and in that pause Catherine saw something flicker across his face. Not guilt, exactly, but something like regret. The recognition that his daughter had slipped beyond his control, that his carefully orchestrated punishment had backfired in spectacular fashion. "You were supposed to accept your fate," Edmund said, and now his voice carried a note of something almost like sorrow. "You were supposed to understand that this was the best outcome available to someone like you, but instead, you chose this." He left without waiting for a response, his footsteps echoing down the hallway until the sound faded into the evening quiet. Catherine waited until the house fell completely silent. She moved through the rooms like a woman in a dream, hyper-aware of every detail. The way moonlight fell across the staircase, the sound of the grandfather clock in the entryway ticking away the hours, the distant voices of servants settling into their quarters for the night. She began to pack with methodical precision. A single bag? She couldn't take more without drawing suspicion. Clothes, practical for travel. The small amount of money she'd been saving in a hidden pocket of her undergarments. A few books that had meant something to her, including the volume of poetry that Samuel had read aloud in the library so many months ago. She packed as though she were packing a grave, each item a goodbye to the life she'd known, each article of clothing a farewell to the person she'd been before Samuel Okonkwo walked into her sitting room. The house was completely dark when she made her way downstairs. Her feet knew the path by memory, avoiding the third step that creaked, skirting around the hall table with its precarious vase of flowers. She moved like a thief in her own home, stealing away the only thing that mattered, her freedom. The barn was locked, but Edmund kept the key hanging in his study on a small hook beside his desk. Catherine had seen it countless times, never thinking she would have occasion to use it. Her hands shook as she retrieved it, half expecting someone to emerge from the darkness and catch her in the act. Nothing happened. The house remained, silent, oblivious to her defiance. The night air was warm and thick as she made her way across the property, the darkness so complete it felt almost solid. Catherine had lived her entire life in this landscape, but tonight it felt foreign. every tree a potential witness, every shadow a threat. Her heart hammered against her ribs with a violence that felt like it might break her open from the inside. The barn doors were heavy, and they creaked as she pulled them open, a sound that seemed to echo across the entire plantation. Catherine froze, listening for any sign that someone had heard, but the night remained undisturbed. Samuel was sleeping when her eyes adjusted to the deeper darkness of the barn, or pretending to sleep. Either way, he snapped awake the moment he sensed her presence, his body tense and ready for violence. His hand went instinctively to the chain, as though he could somehow defend himself against whatever new torment was about to begin. "Samuel," she whispered, moving toward him. "It's me." Recognition flooded his face, followed immediately by terror. "Catherine," he breathed, disbelief and horror mixing in his voice. "What are you doing? If anyone sees you here—" "No one will see," she said, moving toward the chains with the key. Her hands shook so badly she could barely insert it into the lock. "We're leaving. Not tonight. That would be too dangerous, too obvious. But tomorrow, before dawn, before the auction block. We're leaving." "Catherine, no!" Samuel's voice was urgent, his eyes darting between her and the open barn doors as though expecting Edmund to appear at any moment with a whip and dogs. "That's madness. I'm a fugitive slave. You're a white woman. There's nowhere we can go where we won't be hunted, where they won't—" "I know," she interrupted, finally getting the chain around his wrist to open. "I know all of that. I've known it every moment since I realized what I felt for you. But I also know that my father has already destroyed me. I'm already ruined. I'm already cast out. So what does it matter if I disappear entirely? At least disappearing means I'm choosing something, rather than having it chosen for me." She worked frantically at the second chain, aware of every second ticking past, aware that discovery would mean death for Samuel and imprisonment, or worse, for her. "There's a station," Samuel said slowly, understanding beginning to dawn in his eyes, a terrible, beautiful understanding of what Catherine was proposing. "A house about 30 miles north, run by people who believe in abolition, people who help runaways. But Catherine, if you're seen helping me—" "I won't be seen," she said, finally removing the last chain. His wrists bore deep marks where the metal had chafed against his skin, angry red grooves that made Catherine's stomach turn with rage. "I'll tell my father we're leaving at dawn, as he commanded. I'll leave a note saying I've gone ahead to Savannah. By the time he realizes the truth, that I've disappeared and you've disappeared on the same night, will be far enough gone that it won't matter. And then what? Where do we go after the station? We can't just vanish into thin air. There are slave catchers. There are rewards. Your father will hire them. He'll spend his entire fortune hunting us down." Catherine smiled, a small, sad, absolutely certain smile. "North, to Pennsylvania, like you said. To a place where we can disappear into a community that won't ask questions. We'll find work. We'll find a way to live. We won't be free, not legally, not safely, but we'll be together, and that's more than either of us was ever supposed to have." Samuel reached out and touched her face, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. In the darkness of the barn, with nothing but moonlight filtering through the cracks in the wood, with the weight of everything they were about to risk hanging between them, they were finally allowed to be what they'd always been. 2. Human beings who loved each other, consequences be damned. "If we do this," Samuel said quietly, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone, "there's no going back. Not ever. You'll be a fugitive too, an accomplice to a slave's escape. If we're caught, they'll hang me. They'll send you to an asylum or worse. There's no redemption from this, no way to undo it. We'll be hunted for the rest of our lives." "I know," Catherine whispered, leaning into his touch. "Your father will make sure of it. He'll pursue us across state lines. He'll use every connection, every resource. This isn't some romantic adventure, Catherine. This is genuine danger. This is the possibility of a very real, very brutal death." "I know," she repeated. "And you choose this anyway, even knowing what it costs?" I choose you. I choose us. I choose the possibility of something other than the lives they've built for us. Even if that possibility is brief and dangerous and uncertain, even if it ends badly. Yes, I choose this. Samuel pulled her close, and for a moment they simply held each other in the darkness, two people clinging to hope as though it were a life raft in an ocean of despair. We leave at the first sign of dawn, Samuel said finally. We take the northern route through the forest. We avoid the roads where patrols might see us, and we don't stop until we reach the safe house. How will we know where to go? Catherine asked. I've heard whispers, Samuel said. Servants talk when they think no one is listening. There's a white farmstead about 30 miles north, run by Quakers. They have a reputation for helping people like me. If we can reach there, they'll help us make the next leg of the journey. They talked through the night in the barn, not about the danger ahead, but about the possibility beyond it. Samuel described the world north of the Mason-Dixon line, the places he'd heard about where black people could walk free, where mixed couples didn't automatically mean death. Catherine spoke about her dreams. Not the dreams she'd been trained to have, but the real ones she'd hidden away in the deepest part of herself. As dawn began to break, Catherine left Samuel in the barn and returned to the house. She wrote a careful letter to her father, claiming she was going ahead to Savannah as instructed, that she needed time alone to adjust to her new reality. The letter was calculated to seem resigned, broken, exactly what Edmund would expect from a daughter whose rebellion had been crushed. She left it on the sitting room table where he would find it first thing in the morning. Then she gathered her packed bag, dressed in traveling clothes, and made her way back to the barn as the sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon. They left the plantation as quietly as ghosts, moving through the morning mist like phantoms. Catherine had lived her entire life in this landscape, but tonight, or rather this dawn, it transformed into something alien, something hostile. Every tree seemed to be watching. Every sound seemed like a threat. The 30 miles to the safe house took them 2 days of traveling at night, hiding in forests and ravines during daylight. Catherine's fine shoes, designed for parlor walks and social calls, fell apart within the first few hours. Her silk stockings tore on briars and rocks. Her skin burned under the relentless Georgia sun. Her arms ached with a pain she'd never experienced before. Muscles that had never done real work suddenly forced into service, carrying her weight through unfamiliar terrain. Her feet blistered, then bled, then hardened into something more resilient. Her back seized with cramps from sleeping on hard ground. But she didn't complain. She didn't falter. She didn't even consider going back, because every step was a step away from the world that said she was worthless. Every mile was a rebellion against the men who'd tried to define her. Every moment was proof that she was more than what she'd been told she was. Samuel moved through the darkness with practiced efficiency, pulling her along when she stumbled, finding paths through the forest that seemed to materialize from memory alone. She understood then that he'd already considered this escape before, that the moment Edmund had forced him into her life, some part of Samuel had already begun planning the only route available to men like him, north, toward freedom, toward possibility. On the second night, they arrived at the safe house, a modest farmstead set back from the main road, with a small barn and a main house painted white in the Quaker style. A man came out to meet them before they even reached the door, as though he'd been expecting them. "Come," he said simply, his voice carrying the accent of someone born north of the Mason-Dixon line. "Quickly now. You're not safe in the open." They were ushered inside and given water, food, and clean clothes. The farmer's wife, a woman with kind eyes and capable hands, provided medical attention for Catherine's blistered feet, wrapping them carefully while asking no questions. "You'll rest here for 2 days," the farmer said. "Then we have a station farther north. From there, the network will carry you toward Philadelphia. After that, well, you'll need to make your own way, but there are communities there who won't ask questions about where you came from." Samuel finally allowed himself to believe it might be possible. "We made it," he whispered that night as Catherine collapsed against him, utterly exhausted, every muscle screaming in protest. "We made it," she echoed, though they both knew the words were only partially true. But they both knew the real danger was only beginning. Ahead of them lay months of hiding, of running, of constantly looking over their shoulders. Ahead of them lay a precarious existence with no guarantee of safety or stability. They would never be able to live openly, never be able to build a life in the light of day. They would exist in the shadows, always vigilant, always aware that discovery meant capture and likely death. But for the first time in both their lives, they were choosing their own fate. And that, it turned out, was worth more than safety. It was worth more than respectability, more than family, more than security. It was the one thing neither of them had ever possessed: genuine agency, the ability to look at a world that had defined them and say simply, "No, I choose differently." That night, holding each other in the dark of a safe house run by strangers who understood the moral imperative of resistance, Catherine finally understood what her father had never grasped: that by trying to break her through degradation, he had instead taught her the only lesson that mattered: that a person's worth was not determined by the world's judgment, that true rebellion wasn't dramatic or violent or obvious. It was simply the quiet refusal to accept the roles assigned to you. It was choosing love over safety. It was choosing each other. 23 years later, in a modest house on the outskirts of Philadelphia, Catherine Whitmore Okonkwo sat at a wooden table sorting through correspondence. She was no longer young. Her hair, once carefully arranged in the fashions of Georgia Planter Society, was now threaded with gray and pulled back simply. Her hands bore calluses from work, not the delicate hands of a woman of leisure, but the capable hands of someone who had learned to do things for herself. Her face had lines around her eyes that spoke of worry and laughter in equal measure. On the mantel behind her, a single portrait hung, not an official sitting done by a society painter, but a daguerreotype taken just after they'd arrived in Philadelphia. In it, she and Samuel stood together, barely touching but close enough that the proximity spoke volumes. They were both impossibly young in that image, both still bearing the marks of their escape, thin, wary, but alive in a way that no portrait taken in Georgia could have captured. The letter in her hands was from her father. It had taken Edmund Whitmore 5 years to find her address, 5 years of hiring investigators, following rumors, tracking the movements of people who'd helped them escape. The letter was dated almost 2 years ago. Edmund had written it, sealed it, and apparently instructed that it be sent only after his death. Catherine had received notification of that death 6 months prior. She opened the letter slowly, as though it might contain poison. "My daughter, by the time you read this, I will be dead. I have thought often of whether I should write to you, and more often of whether I should remain silent. But as I approach the end, I find myself unable to let you go without some accounting. I do not ask for forgiveness. I do not expect it, and I would not accept it if offered. What I did, what I allowed to happen, cannot be forgiven. I have spent the last 20 years understanding this with a clarity that has become increasingly unbearable. You were right to leave. More than that, you were right to choose. I spent your entire life trying to convince you that choice was a luxury you didn't deserve, that your role was to accept what was given to you. I told myself this was necessary, that the world was harsh and women needed to be prepared for that harshness. But the truth is far simpler and far worse. I was afraid. I was afraid of a daughter who asked questions. I was afraid of a woman who refused to fit into the boxes I'd constructed for her. I was afraid that if I allowed you agency, you would choose something that would embarrass me, that would reflect poorly on my name and my standing. So I tried to eliminate the possibility of choice altogether. I tried to make you small enough, broken enough, that you would simply accept whatever crumbs of life I offered. And when that didn't work, when you refused to break, I gave you to a man I considered beneath you, thinking that degradation would finally teach you your place. Instead, you taught me mine. I have spent these last years watching from a distance as rumors reached me of what you became. A woman living freely in the North, unmarked by scandal because no one in Philadelphia cared about a planter's failed daughter. A woman building a life with the man I had tried to destroy. A woman who proved that everything I believed about the proper order of things was a lie I'd constructed to make myself feel powerful. I do not expect you to respond to this. I do not expect you to write back or acknowledge this letter. What I want, what I've wanted for years, is simply for you to know that I know now what I refused to know then. That you were never the problem. The problem was always me. The problem was always the world that convinced men like me that we had the right to decide the fates of those around us. I am dying, Catherine. The doctor gives me months at most. And as I face that ending, I find I have little to show for my life beyond the accumulation of things and the legacy of a name. I have no children who speak to me. I have no family who visits. I have only the slowly growing certainty that I have wasted everything that mattered. You have something I never will, the knowledge of what you are willing to sacrifice for. You have Samuel. You have chosen each other and built a life in the face of impossible opposition. That is worth more than all of Georgia, more than all the land and slaves and power I accumulated. I cannot undo what I did. I cannot give back the years you spent in hiding, the life you might have lived if you'd been born to a different father. But I can at least bear witness to your triumph. I can at least acknowledge that you were right. The enclosed sum is everything I could liquidate without drawing suspicion. It is not enough to repay what I owe you. No sum could be, but perhaps it can help you build something. Perhaps it can be a small acknowledgement that I understand, finally, what I destroyed and what you preserved. Live well, daughter. Live freely. Live loudly. Live in a way that would have horrified me when I was still the man I used to be, and know that at least at the end I understood. Edmund Whitmore. Catherine set the letter down carefully on the table. She didn't cry. She'd spent years learning not to cry, learning to channel grief and rage into forward motion, into survival, into building. But she sat for a long time in the quiet of her study, the letter resting on the wood before her, processing the words of a dead man who had finally, too late to matter, understood his daughter. Samuel found her there hours later, when the light was beginning to fade. "Bad news?" he asked, noting her expression. "My father is dead," Catherine said. "He's been dead for months. I just received his letter." Samuel pulled up a chair and sat beside her without asking for details. He'd learned long ago that Catherine would tell him what she needed to when she was ready. "He apologized," Catherine continued after a long silence. "He understood, at the end, what he'd done. He sent money. Do you want to use it?" Catherine looked around the modest study, the books they'd collected, the work they'd done, the small but real life they'd built together. Outside, Philadelphia hummed with the sounds of commerce and industry. Somewhere down the street, she could hear children playing. A woman called to someone. Normal sounds. Free sounds. "No," she said finally. "We don't need his money. We built this ourselves. That matters more than anything he could send." But she kept the letter. Over the following months, as Catherine processed her father's death and the strange closure it offered, she found herself thinking often about the girl she'd been, the girl deemed unmarriageable, the girl locked away in a mansion in Georgia, the girl who had believed she was worthless because the world had told her so. That girl would have never believed that this life was possible, that she would be sitting in Philadelphia, in a house she'd helped purchase with wages she'd earned through her own labor, that she would be married, not officially, not legally, but in every way that mattered, to a man she loved, that she would be known and respected in her community for her character, not judged for her past. The scandal from Georgia had never reached Philadelphia. When Catherine and Samuel arrived, they'd simply become another couple starting over. No one asked questions. No one cared about Edmund Whitmore's ruined daughter. In the North, Catherine discovered, there were other women who'd escaped their circumstances, other men who'd chosen freedom over security. There was a whole community of people building lives that defied the rules of the world they'd left behind. She began to work with the Underground Railroad, carefully, quietly, using the resources she had to help others escape the same fate she and Samuel had fled. She hid runaways in safe houses. She forged documents. She raised money for those who needed it. She became, in her way, a criminal, not because she'd committed any crime, but because the laws of the land had decided that helping people escape slavery was illegal. She didn't see it that way. She saw it as the only legal act she'd ever performed. Samuel found work as a carpenter, a skilled trade he'd taught himself during the years of hiding and preparation. The work was honest, the pay modest but reliable. He built houses and furniture and the infrastructure of their new life. In the evenings he read, always read, as though making up for all the years when reading had been forbidden, dangerous, impossible. They had no children. Catherine had been afraid of it, afraid that her body, ravaged by years of hardship and stress, might not be capable of bearing life. But more than that, she'd been afraid of what it would mean to bring a child into a world that would still be hostile to people like them. A child born to a mixed couple would face dangers Catherine herself could barely contemplate. Instead, they poured their love into the community that had taken them in. They mentored young people. They hosted gatherings of abolitionists and free thinkers. They became fixtures of a certain Philadelphia society, not the respectable, wealthy society of merchants and industrialists, but the society of activists and radicals and people who believed that the world could be different. One evening, as Catherine and Samuel sat on their small porch watching the sun set, she said, "Do you ever regret it? Leaving with me that night?" Samuel took her hand. After 23 years, this gesture still felt like a revelation. The simple ability to touch her openly, without fear. "Not for a moment," he said. "Do you?" Catherine thought about her life in Georgia, the endless rooms, the careful restrictions, the slow suffocation of a world that had decided her fate before she was born. She thought about the fever that had broken her marriage prospects, about the relief she'd felt at that rejection, about the years she'd spent waiting for a life that would never arrive. "No," she said, "not for a moment." They sat in silence as the light faded, watching the neighborhood settle into evening. Somewhere, she knew, there were other girls like she had been, other women trapped in circumstances they hadn't chosen, deemed unmarriageable or unsuitable or wrong by a world that had no right to judge them. And somewhere, there were people being hunted for the crime of seeking freedom, people hiding in safe houses, moving north through networks of resistance, risking everything for the possibility of a life they could choose. Catherine thought of her father's letter, of his final understanding that he had been wrong, and she thought about how rare such understanding was. How many people lived their entire lives convinced of their righteousness, never pausing to question the systems that benefited them, never considering the lives destroyed by the choices they'd made. "I want to write something," Catherine said suddenly, "about what happened, about us, about Georgia and the escape and all of it." Samuel looked at her, understanding immediately what such a thing would mean. To write their story would be to claim it, to make it official, to offer it up as testimony. It would be dangerous. It could draw attention from slave catchers or law enforcement. It could endanger their community, but it would also be true. "Then write," Samuel said simply. "Tell our story." Catherine began writing the next morning, in her careful hand, on paper she'd purchased specially. She wrote about the girl she'd been and the man Samuel had been forced to become. She wrote about the library and the books and the first moment their hands had touched. She wrote about the escape and the fear and the terrible, beautiful choice they'd made, together. She wrote about defiance. The manuscript never found a publisher during Catherine's lifetime. Such stories were dangerous, too revolutionary, too critical of the slavery system that still dominated so much of American life. But she kept the pages safe, hidden away in a box beneath the floorboards of her study. She never knew that decades later, long after her death, the manuscript would be discovered, that it would be published in a small edition by abolitionists, that it would become, in its own quiet way, a document of resistance, proof that even in the darkest systems, even in the most restricted circumstances, human beings could choose love over survival, defiance over acceptance, each other over the world's judgment. On her deathbed, at the age of 71, Catherine held Samuel's hand and whispered words meant only for him. "We did it. We became what they said was impossible. We lived. We chose. We refused to be broken." Samuel wept, but Catherine smiled, because she had finally learned what her father had taken a lifetime to understand, that a person's worth was not determined by the world's judgment, that true rebellion was not always visible, not always dramatic, but it was always real, that the greatest act of defiance was simply to refuse to accept the role you'd been assigned and to build something better in its place. She had been deemed unmarriageable. She had been sent to serve a man she was supposed to despise. She had been exiled and hunted and forced to live in the shadows. And in the end, she had built a life more real, more honest, more free than anyone in Georgia could have imagined. That was her triumph. That was her truth. That was the payoff to a title that had seemed to promise only tragedy. She was deemed unmarriageable, so her father gave her to his strongest slave. Because what Edmund Whitmore had intended as a final humiliation had become, instead, an accidental gift. In his cruelty, he had given his daughter exactly what she needed: a reason to choose, a reason to rebel, a reason to become something more than the world had told her she could be. And in that becoming, Catherine Whitmore Okonkwo had achieved something far more valuable than marriage, respectability, or safety. She had achieved freedom, real freedom, the freedom to choose her own life, to love whom she wished, to build something meaningful with another human being who saw her, truly saw her, for exactly who she was. In the end, that was worth more than all of Georgia. It was worth more than anything.